That befuddled falcon who was raised among vultures, what does he know about the ways of his kind? Allama Muhammad Iqbal. In 1990, I toured Waziristan, the tribal areas of Pakistan, along the border with Afghanistan. For the first time, on the invitation of the Burki tribe, to which my mother belonged, both my mother and father were from Pashtun tribes, the Niazi and the Burki. This was the only region in Pakistan that had remained untouched by colonialism. Its people, proud warrior folk who have never been subdued by any invader. Despite the long list of legendary conquerors and adventurers who have passed through their lands, including Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 B, Mahmud of Ghazni, 971 to 1030, Tamburlaine, 1336 to 1405, the Mughal Emperor Babur, 1483 to 1531, Nadir Shah, the Persian Napoleon, 1698 to 1747, and the more recent superpowers, the British and the Russians. According to Sir Olaf Carrow, the last British governor of what was then the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, in his book on the Pashtuns, the lands which are now Afghanistan and the northwest frontier of Pakistan have seen perhaps more invasions in the course of history than any other country in Asia or indeed the world. As early as 1898, Winston Churchill, then a war correspondent, reported back from the northwest frontier, "The frontier tribes will never accept foreign occupation." I had initially been reluctant to make my first visit to the tribal areas, but was persuaded by my cousin Sohail Khan, who was in the frontier force, originally formed from regiments within the British Indian Army and selected purely from the Pashtun tribes. We went to Kanigoram in South Waziristan, where my mother's family originally hailed from. The Burki tribe still lives there and gave me a royal welcome with drumming and dancing and a hail of fire into the air from anti-aircraft guns and Kalashnikovs. The sound was deafening. These people fascinated me. It was like going back in time to the Wild West, an uncultivated terrain of desolate mountain ranges where every man openly carried a gun and was a warrior, making it the most unique place in the world. If the young men saw me, they would come up and challenge me to a shooting contest, targets would be set up, and I would have to prove myself against them. Even the very young boys had heard I was a good shot and wanted to test themselves against me. It seemed everyone knew how to fire a weapon. Despite this fierceness, one of the tenets of the Pashtun code is Melmastia, hospitality. It is not just a matter of giving the guest the very best your household can provide. It also extends to defending your guest's safety with your life, Nanawati. Badal, avenging blood, is the bedrock of the Pashtun code of honor. One of the theories about my mother's branch of the Burki tribe was that they broke away nearly 350 years ago and settled in Jalandhar in India to escape a blood feud. Pashtuns, either escaping vendettas or searching for an easier living, made settlements all the way to Delhi and beyond. The Pashtuns are known for being fiercely protective of their women. However, Pashtun women in the tribal areas are not kept in as strict purdah as they are in the cities. In the countryside, in FAT, A, the federally administered tribal areas, you can see women working in the fields. But when they move to a town or city, they wear the burqa outside the home or are confined within four walls by their male relatives for fear that they will come into contact with men from outside the family. The Pashtuns maintain this extremely strong family system in some form or other, even amongst their communities that have migrated to other areas. The Pashtun homeland stretches from Afghanistan, where they are the largest ethnic group across Pakistan's tribal areas and the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But the largest Pashtun city is Karachi in Sindh province. Waves of Pashtun migration to the commercial capital of Pakistan since the 1950s mean that it is now home to several million of them. Dr. Akhtar Hamid Khan, the founder of the Orangi Pilot Project, a social initiative in a squatter quarter in Karachi, found that because of their powerful family system, the tribal Pashtuns always forged ahead of the other two ethnic communities living in Orangi. The social structure of the tribal areas that I observed and their culture is very different to that in the rest of Pakistan. Far from being the lawless savages of popular myth, the people have lived by an ancient democratic system which allowed them to carry themselves with self-respect and dignity. The concept of honor in South Asian culture has received a bad press because of the deeply offensive honor killings. But by upholding one's honor, impoverished people living hard lives can maintain a sense of dignity and command respect. In the tribal area, this highly decentralized form of democracy is based on the Jirga system local councils of village elders. Every household has a voice in the running of their lives, and every man is considered an equal because people fully participate in decision making. It has created self-governing communities of responsible individuals with no bureaucracy and no centralized government. In terms of dealing with crime, the Pashtun Jirga system acts as a jury that dispenses free and quick justice. A culprit will usually be known to everyone in the village and would be hauled in front of the jury. There is no question of false witnesses, as everybody knows everybody else's credibility. So successful is the system that the tribal areas, until the upheavals of the past few years, have typically been almost crime-free compared to the rest of Pakistan. And this despite every man being armed. The right to carry arms is, for them, a guarantee of freedom, just as early American jurists allowed their citizens this right. As I mentioned earlier, revenge is part of the code of honor. When someone in a family is killed, the whole family are bound to seek revenge. This code of honor is simple, and it predates Islam. It is embedded in their genes. In 87-2, a Pashtun, Sher Ali Afridi, imprisoned on the Andaman Islands where he was serving his sentence, killed the visiting Viceroy Lord Mayo. He felt his imprisonment was an affront to his code of honor and had thus vowed to kill a leading British official. When someone attacks them, either the US with drone aircraft bombing villages or the Pakistani army on operations, both of these are doing more than causing casualties, they are also creating enemies. Caro wrote that in the 1930s there was as much crime in a week in Peshawar as there was in a year in the whole of the tribal area. This system of equality and justice was a big contrast to what I had seen growing up in Punjab, where might was right and landlords could get away with all kinds of abuses towards poor people. The British created the Northwest Frontier Province in 1901 and divided the region into settled and tribal areas. In terms of the great game, the phrase coined to describe British-Russian rivalry in the region, the province was a vital buffer zone between the British Raj and Russian expansionism in Central Asia. But the British had struggled to impose direct rule on the tribal area, eventually coming up with the solution of the Frontier Crimes Regulation, FCR, in the 1870s, based on tribal law. This system still applies in FATA. It seeks to appease the aggrieved party rather than punish the guilty. The government representative, known as the political agent, handles disputes but has to accept the verdict and punishment decided by the Jirga. Tribes are encouraged to keep the peace through subsidies. Most controversially, the FSCR also imposes a system of collective punishment on the entire tribe for crimes. At independence in 1947, the NWFFP voted to join Pakistan, but its tribal areas became a part of the new nation in 1948 only on condition that they be allowed to continue to live by their own laws. So while Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a fully integrated province of Pakistan, FATA is semi-autonomous and still ruled by the colonial era system. The Pakistani government governs through a combination of political agents who are federal civil bureaucrats and tribal elders, with only 44 of Pakistan's laws agreed to prevail there, leaving their way of life intact. There is no Pakistani police or judiciary in the tribal areas, although the roads are subject to federal law. These tribal people are in many ways inspiring. The Puindas were especially fascinating to me. These are the Pashtun nomad tribes who for centuries have migrated between the highlands of Waziristan and Afghanistan in the summer and the plains of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab in the winter. On our way to Kaniguram, we saw the Pundas on the move once, about half an hour before sunset. We came across a small encampment by the side of a stream. One of the beautiful sheepdogs the Pundas keep, known as Kuchi or Kadi, stood guard. I desperately wanted to buy one of these animals. My parents always kept Kuchi, and they make intelligent watchdogs. So I approached the tents, and a young man came up and greeted me. He recognized me, saying he had seen me on television playing cricket once during a trip to Dera Ismail Khan. a town in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. He invited me to where his father and uncle were sitting and introduced me. Unfortunately, they did not have any pups, but we got talking. As we sat there, I became aware of this incredible scene all around me. The Puindas had pitched their tents just a short while before, after a long day's walk. The children were playing amongst the dogs, sheep and goats. A grandmother was chasing the smaller kids. Some women were preparing food. A father was washing his children in the stream. There was laughter and complete harmony all around me. Here were people living the toughest life imaginable with virtually no material possessions. And yet I never heard one complaint during my conversation. For these resilient people, the existence of God and life after death were as obvious as the sun and the moon. On another trip, I came across a different group of Poindas, and I met a tribal elder whose son had recently been killed fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. The son's photo had been garlanded with flowers and depicted a young, strapping, handsome man. He had, the Poindas told me, been the life and soul of their community. "I'm sorry," I said to the father. He simply looked at me and said, "You should congratulate me. My son has embraced martyrdom for a higher cause." One of the main things that struck me during a series of trips to the tribal areas that I undertook between 1990 and 1992 to research my book about the Pashtuns, warrior race, was the total lack of education. So fiercely did they defend their culture that the tribesmen never allowed the British to build schools during the Raj. Yet when I visited them, I found they craved education. Everywhere I went, they wanted schools, but successive Pakistani governments have given them precious few educational facilities. Without education, the tribal area's culture cannot evolve. This is particularly sad because it is a society that would respond well to education. The Pashtuns have clung fiercely to their way of life throughout the centuries. They have no fear of authority, unlike people in the rest of Pakistan, especially in Punjab and Sindh, where centuries of feudalism have made the masses bow before power. It is the confidence derived from their democratic system that has enabled the tribal people to become great generals, officers, and even rulers all over India for centuries. Unlike the poor living under the feudal system who do not aspire to leadership, the tribal Pashtuns are brought up as natural leaders. It is this difference in mentality that made the Pashtun areas harder to conquer than much of the Indian subcontinent. Throughout history, even warring Pashtun tribes will cast aside their differences and stand up to an invader. This is how, in going after a few hundred Al-Qaeda fighters for America's war on terror, the government has raised a rebellion amongst tribes with the potential fighting power of 1 million armed men. In succumbing to Washington's pressure to send the Pakistani army into the tribal areas, we have a conflict that could lead to the collapse of the Pakistani state. In addition, the people of the tribal areas remain marginalized from mainstream politics. Pakistan only gave them the right to vote in 197. Previously, only the Maliks or tribal leaders could vote or contest elections. Most of the country's main political parties have chapters and representatives in FATA, but candidates can participate in polls only on a non-party basis. It also remains the most underdeveloped area of Pakistan, neglected by the state and isolated by its mountainous terrain, which makes the delivery of services and infrastructure challenging. About 60% of the population lives below the national poverty line, and per capita income is half the national average. Per capita public development expenditure is said to be a third of the national average. Eking a living out of the land in many areas is tough, and opportunities to earn a wage limited. The Community Appraisal and Motivation Program, CAMP, and NTCO that operates in FATA has conducted a series of surveys in the area. When asked to name a living national politician they admired, 50% or more of respondents said they could not name one or did not admire any of them. In the 2010 survey, I got the highest rating at 13,200,1%. Zardari was the nearest contender at 4%. Similarly, a 2010 poll in FATA by the New America Foundation and Terror Free Tomorrow found that Tehreek-e-Insaf was the most popular party with just over 28% of the vote. The next most popular was PMBLL with 10%. In neighboring Baluchistan, the tribes are also known for their ferocity and strength. However, thanks to a succession of rulers, from the British to the current Pakistani government, using the Baluchi Sardas, leaders, to control the people, the system of leadership has degenerated from an egalitarian one into an almost feudal-like subservience, as aptly described in his book, Journey to Disillusionment, by the Baluchi Sardar Shahbaz Khan Mazari. In contrast, the Pashtuns have often rebelled against any Malik seen as an agent for the British or the central government. Because of the Jirga system, they are also used to a tradition of debate and are more receptive to intellectual discussion. The university I have built in Mianwali, which is on the edge of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, has drawn great interest, not just from locals, but also from people from Waziristan looking to educate both sons and daughters. Female literacy in the tribal areas is woefully low, estimated at 3%, compared with a national average for women of almost a third. Male literacy in FATA is 295%. In conservative areas of Pakistan, it is not that people are against female education per se. They just want to know that women folk will not have to travel far and that they will be safe. They are also suspicious of education for women being used by foreigners to chip away at their traditions. One of their greatest fears is that a westernized education would detach women from their religion and their culture. Hence the suspicion of foreigners and westernized Pakistanis in parts of the countryside. At Naimal University, we have made sure that cultural norms are respected. It helps too that people there know and trust me. We have actually managed to engineer a mini revolution, with conservative families sending their daughters to study alongside men. It cannot be emphasized enough how isolated some of these communities are in parts of the tribal areas. Some of the villages have been left alone for years in these border areas with Afghanistan, where the Pashtuns move freely from one side to the other. They remain untouched by any form of authority on the Afghan side. It is much the same, ignorant of the history and character of these people, and fired by imperial hubris. In October 2001, the United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan, expecting to succeed where the British in the 19th century and the Russians in the 20th century had failed. This war was ill-fated from the start. A military campaign defined as a battle against Islamic extremism soon became in Afghanistan a liberation struggle against foreign invaders. And the Battle of Afghanistan as 15 million Pashtuns has incensed Pakistan's 25 million Pashtuns. In a repeat of what happened with Vietnam and Cambodia, the Americans have allowed the war to spill into a neighboring country. Musharraf and then Zardari have forced the Pakistani army to launch military operations in the tribal areas. But since our soldiers are seen as proxies for the Americans, they have run into fierce resistance as the militants have declared jihad against them. We now find ourselves fighting what has become an undeclared and bloody civil war. The Americans complain that Pakistan, whether officially or unofficially, helps insurgents fighting the Allied forces in Afghanistan. But they have failed to understand the Pashtun mentality, as sadly did Musharraf. Many Pakistanis in the army, the government and the general public were against the invasion of Afghanistan from the start. But for the Pashtun, their loyalty is clear-cut. Anyone with even a basic knowledge of the history of the region knows that for reasons of religious, cultural and social affinity, the Pashtuns feel a deep-rooted duty to help their brethren on either side of the Durand line. For them, the international frontier is irrelevant, so no government, Pakistani or foreign, will ever be entirely successful in stopping them crossing over the fine 100-mile border to support their people or feeling obliged to offer them shelter if they venture into their territory. Soon after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Americans bombed the Tora Bora cave complex in the White Mountains, believed to be Osama bin Laden's headquarters. A few hundred Al-Qaeda militants crossed the border into Pakistan's tribal areas. They were probably initially welcomed as guests by the Pashtun tribes, in accordance with their ancient traditions. The Americans claim that these militants set a basis from which to wage battle against US and NATO troops in Afghanistan. In addition, the Americans believed that Al-Qaeda's leaders, including Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, were hiding in the region. Washington, failing to understand that the Pakistani government only has indirect control over the tribal areas, threatened to use force if Islamabad did not prevent the tribes from harboring militants. Those who knew the region warned the government against provoking an uprising, but Musharraf was unable to stand up to Washington, and in March 2004, the Pakistan Army launched its first major operation to root out Al-Qaeda, sending helicopter gunships and thousands of troops into South Waziristan, according to Lieutenant General Orakzai. Suspicions that recent assassination attempts against Musharraf had been planned in South Waziristan also spurred him into sending in the troops. At this point, Musharraf put the number of foreign militants in the province at 500 to 600. Yet according to Lieutenant General Orakzai, when he took the army into the tribal areas and worked with the tribes handed over around 250 Al-Qaeda militants to the army. Thanks to pressure from Washington, Pashtun officers in the army were weeded out before the operation, and Orakzai himself, who hails from the Orakzai agency, an area of FATA, was forced into retiring 1 month early. Major General Safta Hossain, a Punjabi, replaced him. The operation was a disaster, with many casualties on both sides. After several weeks of fighting, the operation ended in the Shakai Agreement, in which the tribesmen agreed to encourage foreign militants to register with the authorities in exchange for a kind of amnesty. The accord soon broke down when the Americans killed Nek Mohammed in June 2004 through a drone attack. This pattern of military operations in Waziristan, followed by truces, continued for the next couple of years. American pressure mounted, convinced that the area was a safe haven for militants. Orakzai, who was governor of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa between 2006 and 2008, told me that most of these agreements fell apart under US pressure and were never broken by the militants, including the Maransha Accord he negotiated in North Waziristan in September 2006. Some analysts and media commentators have complained that this agreement was instrumental in allowing the militants to increase their power and infrastructure and combine the various local militant groups and factions into a cohesive Pakistani Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban (TIP). However, Orakzai says the army's actions in the tribal areas were counterproductive because collateral damage through bombing villages added to the ranks of the militants, unifying opposition and intensifying hatred towards the Pakistani government and its American backers. I advocated using good intelligence, then targeted operations against the militants that did not hurt local people. If the locals side with the Taliban, there is no way you can catch someone in the tribal areas, he told me. Once he was trying to explain to a US Army delegation the advantages of having a peace agreement with the Taliban, we were taking too many casualties, he said. And military operations cause collateral damage, which in turn increases militancy. One of the Americans bluntly replied, "We are paying you to fight, not to our peace agreements." Hence, the US pressure for Pakistan to do more in the tribal area had a very heavy price for Pakistan. Our subservient leaders kept buckling under American pressure, engaging in military operations, bombing villages in the tribal areas, leading to a backlash of terrorist attacks in Pakistani cities. We Pakistanis became used to this. Whenever a high-powered delegation came from Washington, either the tribal areas would be bombed or some high-value Al-Qaeda member would be picked up to coincide with the visit. Once a government minister told me, on the eve of Condoleezza Rice's visit to Pakistan, that the next day she would receive 5 presents. Sure enough, the following morning it was reported that 5 Al-Qaeda had been killed in a shootout, conveniently hitting the headlines the day she arrived. When George W. Bush visited Pakistan, the headlines read, 40 foreign militants killed in North Waziristan. Later, the truth emerged. Family and friends in Sedgai village in North Waziristan had gathered to welcome a businessman returning from the Gulf, and it was these innocent civilians who had been bombed. Sir Olaf Caro also documented the time-honored pattern of Pashtun vengeance. Every time the British launched an operation against the tribes, these would retreat into the mountains. There would be a lull in violence, and then the insurgents would regroup and return, numbers boosted by the relatives of the dead, now duty bound to exact retribution. As a result, before bombing a village, the British would drop leaflets in the area so the people would leave and the attack would cause only material damage. I have heard so many stories of innocent people suffering because of this campaign, including from one of my own party workers. Khalil-ur-Rahman, Tehrik-e-Insaf District Party head in Bajor, was traveling in the tribal areas with his family when a Pakistani army helicopter appeared overhead. As per the army's instructions for locals in Fatah, they got out of the car and put their hands up. But the helicopter fired on them anyway. Khalil's 6-year-old son lost his legs, and his brother and nephew both died. I took Khalil to tell his story on one of Pakistan's most watched talk shows, Capital Talk. We would die for Pakistan, but after this, how can I stop members of my family joining the Taliban? Khalil told the interviewer. One has turned against the other, as some side with the Taliban and others side with the army. The government encouraged tribes willing to help to form lashkars, informal militias, to fight the insurgency, but they were just decimated by the militants, who viewed them as American lackeys. Even once there is peace, these vendettas will continue to take their toll for years to come as families try to avenge the death of loved ones. A Waziri tribal elder and former senator I knew, Faridullah Khan, was killed in 2005 because he was considered to be pro-government. This is exactly what used to happen under the British. Any Malik perceived to be collaborating with the colonial rulers was killed, particularly in Waziristan, which is known as the wildest part of the tribal areas. I have a picture of Faridullah standing with Jimmy Goldsmith, Jemima's father, from when we visited the tribal belt in 1905. The death of respected elders like him has had serious repercussions for Fatah, undermining the tribal structure and creating a power vacuum, a vacuum that has been in part filled by the Pakistani Taliban. For the sake of flushing out what they said were a few hundred foreign fighters, Islamabad effectively created thousands of pro-Taliban fighters and killed many innocent civilians. But it was too embarrassing for the government to admit that it had set the army on its own people. 26 Pakistani journalists have been killed so far in Fatah. And there is a strong suspicion that they were targeted because the government didn't want independent reporting of the situation there. As happened with East Pakistan, propaganda, lies and deception have been used to try to shield the public from what was really happening. Still more damaging than these army operations has been the covert use by the Sinoida of unmanned drone aircraft in the tribal belt. Shamefully, this is done with the connivance of the Islamabad government. As Zahid Hussain points out in The Scorpion's Tail, it is the first time in history that an intelligence agency of one country has been using robots to target individuals for killing in another country with which it is not officially at war. When the issue of military operations was debated in the National Assembly in 2004, I was one of the few voices speaking out for people I traveled amongst. Almost all of the parliamentarians were ignorant of the tribal areas and were clueless about the mess that was being created. I said, if you had read the history of the area, you would not have found yourself in these quicks, and I was attacked for romanticizing them and later accused of being a Taliban sympathizer. It was obvious to anyone who understood the region that this attack on the people in the tribal areas would be a disaster for Pakistan. And sure enough, in 2 drone attacks on consecutive days in South Waziristan, over 100 people were killed in September 2004, which sparked off the beginning of the Masood tribe's rebellion against the government. To make matters worse, the government tried to claim that those being killed in these attacks were all foreign militants, a lie designed to make people swallow the awful truth that in return for dollars, we were bombing our own people. It's sad that the government are repeating the actions that befell the country during the 1971 East Pakistan crisis, using propaganda to cover the fact they were fighting their own people for foreign militants now. It was Indian back then. Numbers of casualties are hard to verify, given the vastly different accounts that come from the army and the Taliban. Reporters are not allowed into the tribal areas, and media reports often cite locals as saying the corpses of those killed are burned beyond recognition, making it even harder to establish who has been slain. After a drone attack, no one dares go to help the wounded, as there is always a fear that the site could be bombed again. So for hours, people can hear the cries of the wounded. Major General Kayor Mahmood claimed in early 2011 that almost all those killed in drone strikes were terrorists, showing how low our government had sunk, blatantly lying to cover up these immoral drone strikes. At the Pakistani Ex-Servicemen Association meeting I attended, a tribal elder from North Waziristan, Khulabat Khan, challenged this, arguing that if an attack killed 20 people, then at least 18 of them were civilians. He questioned how the government could verify the identity of the dead when drone attacks are typically in areas where the Pakistani military does not operate. Based on their drones database, Peter Bergen and Catherine Tidyman at the New America Foundation estimate that between 492 and 2,028 people have died in 244 drone strikes between 2004 and May 2011. They put the civilian fatality rate over this period at approximately 20%. However, analysis by Pakistani newspaper, the news found that in 2010, about 59% of those killed were civilians. Furthermore, the news estimates that despite this appalling record, the attacks only killed a fifth of the 100+ high-value targets on the Chia's hit list in 2010. This campaign, initiated by Bush, has been ramped up under Obama's remit. The news estimates that unmanned aircraft strikes hit an annual record of 244 in 2010, more than doubling from 2009. One also has to imagine the number of innocent people maimed and injured in these incidents. This campaign of terror from the skies has provoked immense anger and outrage in Pakistan. Karim Khan from North Waziristan tried to sue the head of the CIA, who was whisked away from Pakistan, for the death of his son and brother in a drone strike in Waziristan, seeking us $500 million in compensation. To justify this rampant violation of Pakistani sovereignty, the Americans have run a consistent campaign of demonization against our country. A succession of US officials and analysts have branded Pakistan the most dangerous country in the world for everyone and a nuclear-armed crucible of jihadi culture, exporting terrorists and destabilizing its neighbors, accused us of hosting the most dangerous component of all, Quetta being the most anti-us country in the world and the most likely source of the next terrorist attack against America. Everybody from Senator Bob Graham to Bruce Riedel, former National Security Advisor to President Clinton, as well as Vice President Joe Biden, has participated in this chorus of condemnation. What Washington fails to understand is that the existence of a small minority of hardcore militants in certain areas of the country does not mean Pakistan is on the verge of being taken over by religious fundamentalists. The war on terror is certainly pushing people towards extremes of opinion. But those who know Pakistan know that there will never be Talibanization in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, the Taliban succeeded not because of their ideology, but because they promised people rule of law after years of war and the atrocities and corruption of the warlords. There is some misconception in the West that the Afghan Taliban replaced a secular government. In fact, they took over from warring mujahideen that included people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, initially supported by the CIA when he fought the Soviets, and who was considered a religious fanatic by the Russians. In every country where Islam has spread, the character of the people has shaped the religion. Often, the underlying culture remains with only those customs repugnant to Islam filtered out. Because of the hostility of their territory, the Pashtun culture has always been austere and conservative. Islam is an intrinsic part of life for Pashtuns as for most Pakistanis. If there is support for Sharia law, it is because they believe it offers a fairer system of justice and a more equal society than the Pakistani state has hitherto given them. They are also strongly against the way the United States has handled Islamic terrorism since 9/11 and see the fighting in Afghanistan as a battle for freedom against foreign occupiers 30 years before. The men fighting in Afghanistan against foreign occupation were hailed by US President Ronald Reagan as the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. In the 2002 elections, there was a sweeping and unprecedented victory for the Mutahida Majlis-e-Amal, headed by the two religious parties, Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam, Jamia and Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamia, because of their opposition to the invasion of Afghanistan. But that does not mean there is wide support for the Taliban ideology. The militants' attacks on girls' schools and the desecration of saint shrines are particularly resented. In its 2009 Understanding Fatah poll, the CO camp found that respondents ranked democracy, the independence of the judiciary, and women's rights as the biggest human rights issues in Pakistan. Besides, as the Pak Institute for Peace Studies, PIPS concluded in a report on attitudes towards militancy and extremism, local culture has proved resilient, even in the areas where culture or traditions had been subdued by radicalization, as the militants tried to impose their version of Islam on local people. The culture reasserted itself once this militant influence faded. It uses the example of SWAT, where following a major military operation to oust the Taliban in 2009, local traditions and customs resumed. Even in the 19th century, during the twilight days of India's Mughal Empire, when Sid Ahmed Berelvi founded a revolutionary Islamic movement, it failed to take hold. Berelvi preached jihad against non-Muslim influences and tried to rally the Pashtun tribes to his cause, but they disliked his rigid brand of Islam and abandoned him, leaving him to be slain by the Sikhs who had at that time conquered the settled Pashtun areas. There is a strong Sufi influence in Pakistan, which will always be at odds with the strict literal Islam of Wahhabi ideology that influences many militant groups. This tension is represented by the two main schools of thought for Sunni Muslims in Pakistan. Berelvis typically lean towards South Asia's traditional brand of Sufi Islam, with its saints and shrines and message of tolerance. Deobandis, on the other hand, are more ideologically aligned with the Wahhabis and are therefore more sympathetic to the Taliban's version of Islam. Pakistan could have suggested far more effective methods of rooting out Al-Qaeda. To those of us who know the tribes, the obvious solution was to work with them, to cajole them, and to encourage them to collaborate. After all, they have been known to contribute to Pakistan's national interests in the past. The tribal Pashtuns sent their Lashkars to fight in Kashmir in 1948 and supplied volunteers to the Pakistan Army in the 1965 war. But one government after the other has failed to defend Pakistan's own interests. Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars cites Zardari in a discussion with then CII Director Mike Hayden about drone attacks, saying the chilling words, "Collateral damage worries you Americans. It does not worry me." He might as well have said that. To him, us dollars are worth more than Pakistani lives. The WikiLeaks cables expose the true extent of the Pakistani government's collaboration in these unlawful extrajudicial killings. One quoted Prime Minister Yousaf Raza Silani as saying about the drone strikes, "I don't care if they do it as long as they get the right people. We'll protest in the National Assembly and then ignore it." But of course, the strikes often don't get the right people. How can an exploding bomb in villages differentiate between innocent civilians and militants? The cables also revealed that small teams of US Special Forces soldiers have been secretly deployed alongside Pakistani military forces in the tribal areas, helping to track down militants and coordinate drone strikes, something that Islamabad has never publicly acknowledged. Furthermore, the cables record Pakistani officials telling US counterparts that locals don't mind the attacks, belying the survey by the New America Foundation and Terror Free Tomorrow that found more than 3/4 of FATA residents opposed them. In fact, it revealed only 16% thought these strikes accurately targeted militants. It also showed that with thousands of mercenaries from companies like Blackwater inside our borders, such is the suspicion of these agents who live in high-walled villas in the cities and travel in convoy in their 4x4s with tinted glass, that the majority of Pakistanis believe these. Contractors are themselves involved in terrorism, especially after the Raymond Davis affair. Within Pakistan, both Musharraf and Zardari have found willing support from the country's elite, ever fearful of the supposed advance of Talibanization. There is a Chinese saying that one should know one's enemy. But Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars demonstrates the Americans' frightening ignorance of the Pashtun character and its emphasis on hospitality and revenge. They think Islamabad has control over the tribal areas, but not only does the federal government have little sway over them, most shockingly, the ruling elite is as clueless as the Americans about this area. That is why I have told visiting US politicians again and again that Washington must seek alternative points of views about what is happening in the tribal areas. I have recommended they speak to people who come from the region and have first-hand knowledge of what is really going on there. As revelations from WikiLeaks show, it is becoming clear that our dollar-addicted elite has a vested interest in prolonging this war to keep US aid flowing in. The US puppets have tried to use the same scare tactics on Pakistanis in an effort to rally public opinion around their policies. Most Pakistanis have seen through the propaganda and insisted it was not Pakistan's war and that we were killing our own people for American dollars. When a young charismatic cleric by the name of Maulana Fazlullah sprang into prominence in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa's Swat Valley, fomenting unrest following the Red Mosque affair, the government took the opportunity to terrify Pakistanis with the idea that the Taliban had their sights on Islamabad. Now, many people, particularly our country's opinion makers, who know nothing of rural Pakistan, do not understand the difference between Swat and the tribal areas. They think all Pashtuns are the same. But Swat is very different to the tribal areas in terms of politics, history, and geography, where much of the tribal areas are made up of inhospitable mountain terrain. Swat is a green and fertile valley, once known as the Switzerland of the East. It was a princely state until 1969, run like a personal estate by the Wali of Swat with a combination of tribal customs and Sharia law. It had a rich Buddhist history, one of the highest literacy rates in Pakistan, and was relatively crime-free, safe enough to draw hippies in the 1970s looking for a chilled-out haven in which to smoke pot. Until 2007, it was still a popular ski resort and weekend getaway for the elite of Islamabad. Unlike in the tribal areas, where only 44 federal laws apply, Swat, like the rest of the settled areas, is legally and politically run like the rest of Pakistan. And unlike the tribal areas, it shares no border with Afghanistan. The had though since Zulfikar Ali Bhutto ousted the Wali in 1969 and incorporated Swat into the civil administration of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, been discontent. Political interference and manipulation by various Pakistani governments, along with the corruption of government officials, had corroded traditional tribal democracy, and over the years crime rates had risen. According to my cousin Jamshed Burki, who used to be commissioner of Malakand, the administrative division Swat comes under. When Pakistan's justice system was established in Swat, the murder rate shot up from 10 a year in 1974 to 700 a year in 1975. Consequently, resentment against the Pakistani government system of justice, which was seen as corrupt, expensive, and inefficient, had been simmering, eventually feeding into a movement calling for Sharia law, known as Tehreek-e-Nafaz-e-Shariat-e Mohammadi, Movement for the Enforcement of Islamic Law. This was founded by Maulana Fazlullah's father-in-law, Maulana Sufi Muhammad, an Afghan jihad veteran. When Muhammad was imprisoned in 2002, the more radical Fazlullah assumed leadership of the movement. Fazlullah earned the nickname Radio Mullah after setting up a radio station to propagate his movement. He was almost like a televangelist and drew a strong female following who would donate their jewelry to his cause, fired by the bloodshed of the Lal Masjid affair. He urged his followers to rebel against the government and its security forces. He appealed to the poorest strata of society, some of whom had unfairly taken over common land when Swat joined Pakistan. Militants targeted certain big landowners and in some areas distributed the profits from their crops amongst landless peasants. Worried by Fazlullah's growing band of followers and their lawlessness, Musharraf sent the army into Swat in the autumn of 2007 to crush the militants. But in early 2008, the PPP-led coalition took power and initiated peace talks, which took a long time. Sufi Muhammad was released from prison and brokered a deal that saw Sharia law imposed on the Swat Valley in return for the Taliban laying down their arms. Westernized Pakistanis saw the implementation of Sharia as a backward step, but all Sufi Muhammad was doing was tapping into a long-standing desire amongst ordinary Swatis for accessible justice. Sher Khan, a former Union Council Nazim, local mayor, who had stood as a candidate for my party in the provincial assembly elections, was involved in these negotiations. He told me that as part of the accord, about 1,500 militants surrendered themselves to the army, only to be brutally tortured in custody. This treatment only served to radicalize the young men, and most of them later became fanatics. Sher Khan, who had helped bring about this peace deal in good faith, was appalled once again. Strong arm tactics by the establishment backfired. When the army withdrew from Swat and released the detained insurgents, many of these men, hungry for revenge against the security forces, rushed into the power vacuum, according to Shah Khan. Some of the greatest atrocities committed at this time were by those who had been brutalized while in army detention. Fasulullah's forces had been further bolstered by a ragtag collection of jihadi and sectarian groups. Common criminals, Sharia law supporters, and angry peasants. Locals began to turn against the Taliban as they imposed their brutal rule with a campaign of violence, beheading anyone who opposed them or whom they suspected of being a government spy, kidnapping, burning down schools, and attacking DVD shops and barbers. The Pakistani government was able to use this total breakdown of law and order to convince the public both that this was an extension of what was happening in the tribal areas and that the Taliban was set to march on the capital. Again, the media were manipulated to rally support for army intervention. A journalist in SWAT told me at the time that intelligence agencies had told him to put out more stories on Taliban atrocities. He also said the agencies were trying to sideline the Deobandis, the ideological brethren of the Taliban, stoking Barelvi concerns about Deobandi and Taliban desecration of Sufi shrines and tombs in order to rally opposition to the militants. I am cynical about how the government handled the whole operation. Zardari deterred for 2 months before endorsing the terms of the February 2009 peace deal, waiting till April to sign the law introducing Islamic Sharia law as demanded by the militants, while he deterred SWAT further descended into chaos. Within a few weeks, a couple of jeep loads of Taliban were spotted in the district south of SWAT, Buner. This unleashed a wave of panic with newspaper headlines warning that the Taliban had advanced to within 60 miles of Islamabad. The army operation was timed to coincide with Zardari landing in Washington, and it was no surprise that he was praised for the SWAT operation and used that to pitch for more aid. "We are fighting to save the world," he told a meeting of the Friends of Pakistan in Japan a couple of weeks later. As if a few thousand Taliban in Pakistan were going to destroy the 500,000 strong army and threaten global security. Yet, what was going on in SWAT was a shambolic and mainly criminal revolt that did not even have the popular support of the locals. The government should have implemented a focused commando operation to take out the movement's top leadership. Instead, the army's full-scale assault meant more than 2 million people were displaced, many innocent lives were lost, and the local economy was devastated. Alarmed at the situation, I went to SWAT just as people were streaming out of the area. Locals told me that they had been given an hour to leave before the military bombardment started. A young boy told me he had seen dead bodies, civilians killed in army bombing. There is no doubt people hated what the Taliban were doing, but they were angry about the army's heavy-handedness. Despite the intervention, Fazlullah and his main accomplices got away and are believed to have fled to Afghanistan. Anyone who opposed the government's strategy, including me, was branded a Taliban sympathizer. A friend of mine, Nadim Iqbal, spent 3 months working in camps for people displaced by the fighting in SWAT, and after many conversations with the camp inhabitants and army officers, he came to the same conclusions. The SWAT operation was done because the government wanted more aid money from Washington for services rendered, and that a more focused commando operation would have done the trick. Nadim said it was the only time he had wanted to give up on Pakistan and get a Canadian passport. This American manipulation of Pakistani politics has only served to undermine its puppet rulers. When people see how dependent our already unpopular leaders are on Washington, it erodes their authority even more. Pakistanis are understandably incensed that the government clearly allows American intelligence agents to operate unimpeded within their country, a fact revealed by the case of Raymond Davis, the CTI operative, who shot 2 people dead in Lahore in January 2011. Another man died when a car from the American consulate knocked down a passing pedestrian in its rush to assist Davis. Defying Islamabad's demands for those in the car to be handed over, Washington has allowed them to flee the country. Davis was promptly arrested, though, and the Americans have tried to claim diplomatic blanket immunity from prosecution for him, saying he killed the men in self-defense during an attempted robbery. However, newspapers have reported that he shot them repeatedly in the back, undermining that story. American officials have admitted to the press that Davis was part of a covert, CIA-led intelligence team surveying militant groups. One of the dead men's wives, 19-year-old Shumaila Kanwal, committed suicide by swallowing rat poison in despair of ever getting justice for her husband. In a scene that was played over and over again on Pakistani news channels, she told reporters at her hospital bedside just before her death that she wanted blood for blood. She told them she was committing suicide because I will not get justice. The Davis case triggered demonstrations across the country, created a diplomatic firestorm, and inflamed anti-American feelings more than ever. Shumela Kanwal's distraught words illustrate the kind of anger and despair that in the tribal areas leads people to blow themselves up to avenge the death of their relatives, whether from drone attacks or military operations. As David Kilcullen, a counterinsurgency expert and former advisor to General David Petraeus, and Andrew Exum, a fellow at think tank the Center for a New American Security, wrote in the New York Times, every dead civilian killed in a drone strike represents an alienated family, a new desire for revenge, and more recruits for a militant movement that has grown exponentially even as drone strikes have increased. Sure enough, as military operations by the Pakistani army and drone strikes have intensified, so have terrorist attacks. According to Farooq Salim at Pakistani Think, thank the Center for Research and Security Studies, there were only 89 terrorism-related deaths in 2003, but the toll peaked at 1155 in 2009 when army intervention was at its height. Civilians bore the brunt of this as the terrorists shifted their attention from security forces to increasingly soft targets such as the campus of Islamabad's International Islamic University and markets in Lahore and Peshawar. One glaring example of the way in which the government's policy simply escalated the violence was the 2006 airstrike on a madrasa said to harbor militants in Bajor, the smallest of the Fatah territories near the Afghan border. At least 80 people died, and news reports cited locals saying 62 of them were children under the age of 18. Militants vowed revenge, and it was swiftly followed by a suicide bombing attack on a military garrison, killing 42 army recruits. The man who carried out the assault was said to have been a relative of one of the children killed in the Bajor madrasa. Still worse was the cack-handed cover-up of American involvement in the madrasa bombing. The Pakistani military claimed responsibility for it, but locals and opposition politicians said that the strike was conducted by an American drone aircraft. According to the New York Times, residents said Pakistani army helicopter gunships appeared firing rockets after the initial explosions. The Pakistani government denied the claim, although Christina Lamb of the Sunday Times later reported that a key aide to Musharraf had admitted that they had thought it would be less damaging if we said we did it rather than the US says. Nor has US foreign policy or military strategy fared any better in Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai's regime is undermined by the weakness of Afghanistan's state institutions, allegations of vote rigging, and its inability to control either rampant government corruption or the diabolical security situation. US and NATO forces are resented for their intrusiveness, for the bombing of fields, orchards, and houses, but most of all, for blunders that have led to civilian deaths. There is also immense suspicion about where most of the US-56 billion development budget approved by the US Congress for Afghanistan has gone. Only a fifth of this money was at the disposal of the Afghan government. The rest was to be used by the US State Department, the Department of Defense, and USAID. This all, of course, plays into the hands of the Taliban, who can argue that their regime provided, if not freedom, then more security than Karzai's US-backed administration. They are further uprooting what state infrastructure exists by setting up their own shadow government in parts of the country. The United States and its allies have at times tried to justify the invasion of Afghanistan by claiming they wanted to protect Afghan women's rights, but the Afghan politician and women's rights activist Malalai Joya has highlighted the fact that many of the warlords returned to power with Karzai's government have just as unpleasant views on women as the Taliban. Dust has been thrown into the eyes of the world by your governments, she told The Independent. You have not been told the truth. The situation now is as catastrophic as it was under the Taliban for women. Your governments have replaced the fundamentalist rule of the Taliban with another fundamentalist regime of warlords. Joya herself has received intimidation and death threats from Afghan MPs after slamming the Afghan government for including notorious warlords in power. The question I am surprised no one asks is about men who fought the Soviet invaders of their land and in the process lost 1 million men, but won. Why would they not fight the Americans? The US government might have convinced their own public they were the good guys, while the Soviets were the bad guys. But the people of Afghanistan saw them both as invaders. Bob Woodward has revealed how Obama, while debating whether to send more troops to Afghanistan or not, after coming to power, always asked the right questions. What are we fighting for? What will we achieve? And what constitutes victory? The generals resort to their usual policy of fear-mongering and claim that if they don't win in Afghanistan, then they will have to fight Islamic militants on the streets of New York. Part of the distortion of the truth is that the US are not fighting freedom fighters, but the Taliban ideology. These words are very similar to those spoken by the men who promoted the Vietnam War, talking about the domino effect that if they didn't fight in Vietnam, other countries would fall to the communists till they were on America's doorstep. And later, when Vietnam fell to the communists, 3 million people had died and there was no domino effect. The parallels with Vietnam go deeper. The failure of the war in Afghanistan has led to Pakistan becoming a punchbag for the US, just as Cambodia became one over Vietnam. In the so-called safe haven in North Waziristan, the Haqqani Taliban group, viewed by the US as one of its deadliest threats in the area, fields a maximum of 5,000 men, although the number is probably less than that. Is it possible that the US, with all its military might, is losing in Afghanistan thanks to these five? Senior US officials pushed the Pakistan army to do more, blaming Pakistan for their failures in Afghanistan on the Haqqani. It is very important Pakistan doesn't share Cambodia's fate. If the Pakistan army goes into North Waziristan after the 5,000 militants, what is going to be the fate of the 305,000 inhabitants of the area? Will there become collateral damage? CIA Director Leon Panetta, according to Bob Woodward, also piled the pressure on Obama, advising him that no democratic president can go against military advice. Sadly, Obama, going against all his better instincts, heeds him rather than Colin Powell, who tries to tell him he doesn't always have to listen to the generals. What makes me feel sorry for Obama is that during this whole debate, there was no credible government in Pakistan to advise him. A sovereign and credible Pakistani government could have helped him find an exit strategy for Afghanistan, could have pledged to prevent Al-Qaeda fighters from using Pakistani soil to launch attacks on the West, could have facilitated talks, could have played a major role in bringing the various parties together. Pakistan, after Afghanistan, had the most to lose from a troop surge. Yet when this vital debate was taking place, there was no input from the Pakistan government. Instead, all Zardari was interested in doing was giving Obama whatever advice would lead to Washington pumping more money into Pakistan to prop up his corrupt government. The supreme irony was that it was the USS who was responsible for engineering the 2008 elections to get a corrupt and pliant government to do its bidding. The current strategy can only increase radicalization, a dangerous prospect given that Pakistan is a country with a fast-growing population, a youth bulge and high rates of unemployment. Now there will be a generation born of anger, an army of young men who lost relatives to US drones or Pakistani military operations. And that radicalization will not just be limited to the poor and dispossessed. Even for the youth of the rich elite, Pakistan's abdication of responsibility for its own sovereignty is a searing humiliation. A.N. Paul has revealed that 80% of Pakistanis now view the United States as a bigger security threat to the country than India, no mean achievement by the US, bearing in mind Pakistan has fought 3 wars with India. Anger against America's political coercion and imperial designs blends with resentment against the breakdown of traditional societies by Western cultural forces into a combustible mix. For some Pakistanis, as with other Muslims, Westernization is seen as a destructive force, provoking a retreat to the security and certainty of religious codes and traditional ways of life. The tragic shooting of the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, in early 2011 showed only too clearly the growing polarization of Pakistani society. Taseer had attempted to defend a Christian woman sentenced to death under Pakistan's blasphemy law and spoke out against it being used to persecute innocent people, both Muslims and minorities. As a result, he was shot dead in broad daylight outside a fashionable cafe in Islamabad by one of his own guards. The war on terror has divided the country into those who are pro-American and anti-Islam, and those who are anti-American and pro-Islam. Before 9/11 Taysir's remarks recommending a change to the blasphemy law in order to prevent its misuse might not even have got a mention in the newspapers. At the worst, they might have roused a few statements by clerics wanting to mobilize support amongst their constituencies. But in the current polarized climate, everyone and anyone is at risk if they happen to be on the wrong side of the divide. The Taliban labels anybody who opposes them as pro-American. Imams of mosques who have condemned suicide attacks as being anti-Islamic have been accused of being American collaborators and shot or blown up by suicide bombers. Members of the pro-American Awami National Party, ANB, that governs Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, have been repeatedly targeted by the Taliban for the party's stance against the militants who also see Christians, Shias, Ahmadis regarded as non-Muslims in Pakistan and their places of worship as fair game. On the other side, those of us who have objected to the military operations and excessive collaboration with the United States are labeled Taliban sympathizers. This means that a meaningful debate on this whole issue of war on terror will become more and more difficult. People are petrified of being caught on the wrong side of the argument. The other thing Taysir's death has revealed is the erosion of the writ of the state. His murderer was lionized and showered with rose petals by lawyers when he appeared in court. No action was taken against religious leaders who in mosques, at rallies and on television arguably incited murder during the period of fevered national debate that led up to the shooting. Zardari, a close friend of Taysir's, did not even attend his funeral. 2 months later, the Minorities Minister Shahbaz Bhatti was killed by a gunman outside his mother's house in Islamabad. As the state gets weaker and weaker, different power players are jostling to assert themselves. Just as during the decline of the great Mughal Empire, various warlords and governors started forming their own independent power bases. As the politicians barricade themselves in with ever greater security details, diverting scarce resources from the streets of Pakistan, daily murders in Karachi and Baluchistan go unchecked. A civil war rages along most of our western border, and crime and corruption surge higher and higher. America frequently invokes fear of the state collapsing and Pakistan's nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. But its tactics are fueling polarization, radicalization, and chaos, which could lead to exactly the kind of destabilization that it most fears. The weaker the Pakistani state gets, the less it will be able to control extremism. When in 2010 news reports said that senior US commanders in Afghanistan were pushing to expand special operations ground raids into Pakistan's tribal areas to seek out Afghan Taliban, Anato Levin, professor in the War Studies Department of King's College London and a senior fellow of the New America Foundation in Washington, described it as a lunatic idea. He wrote in an article widely reprinted in Pakistan that the one thing that would certainly lead to the collapse of the Pakistani state and an immense surge in extremist and terrorist strength would be if the Pakistani army were to split and parts of it were to mutiny against the alliance with America. He goes on to explain that various Pakistani army officers have warned him that the entry of US ground forces into Pakistan in pursuit of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is by far the most dangerous scenario for both Pakistan-US relations and the unity of the Pakistani army. As one retired general explained, drone attacks, though ordinary officers and soldiers find them humiliating, are not a critical issue because the Pakistani military cannot do anything about them. It's also worth bearing in mind that assassination attempts against Musharraf and an attack on the Pakistani army, headquarters in Rawalpindi by militants, were both inside jobs, while Taysir's murder by one of his own guards sparked fears about possible radicalization within the country's elite security forces. The discovery of Osama bin Laden's hiding place on 2 May was humiliating for every Pakistani, but his death was devastating for the Pakistani armed forces. For the first time, people openly criticized the army in the media, asking repeatedly, how can we spend such a large part of our budget on the army, and yet it could not protect our sovereignty? How could the army not respond to helicopters flying about, to the sound of explosions and gunfire going on for nearly 3/4 of an hour so close to their academy. No one knew the building under attack was Osama bin Laden's, then it could have been anyone's, so where was the army? Why was it not at least making the effort to protect its citizens before the true identity of the inhabitant was revealed? There was a tremendous amount of anger. And my biggest worry remains that if things continue as they are, we could face a rebellion within the army's ranks, the ultimate nightmare situation for Pakistan. Aside from the tremendous losses to Pakistan and Afghanistan caused by Washington's callous and misguided policies, these cause huge detriment to America's own interests. This has been revealed again and again. Most infamously, Faisal Shahzad, the Pakistani American sentenced for the botched Times Square bombing, cited US foreign policy as justification during his trial. I want to plead guilty, and I'm going to plead guilty 100 times over, he said, because until the hour the US pulls its forces from Iraq and Afghanistan and stops the drone strikes in Somalia and Yemen and in Pakistan and stops the occupation of Muslim lands and stops killing the Muslims and stops reporting the Muslims to its government, we will be attacking the US, and I plead guilty to that. When asked by the judge about the children he might have killed had his attack in New York, Bin successfully pointed out that drones in Afghanistan and Iraq don't see children, they don't see anybody. They kill women, children, they kill everybody. Personally, I think the radicalization of Muslims in the West as they watch the bloodshed and chaos spread by Washington's policies, not just in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also in countries like Somalia and Yemen, is a far greater threat to Western security. Most of the struggles against colonialism in the 20th century were led by people who had studied in the West. Jinnah, Gandhi, and Nehru all had the opportunity to see Western democratic societies in action and were inspired to campaign for the same rights for their countrymen. My own awareness of democracy, the rule of law, and the welfare state was awakened when I first went to England to study. Muslims who have grown up and been educated in the West will have a greater awareness of the ways in which human rights laws are broken in the name of the war on terror than many of those living in Muslim countries. They will be aware that no civilized law allows anyone to be judge, jury, and executioner, as the CIA is when it fires on people with its drones, eliminating suspects along with their wives, children, and neighbors. The Americans may believe that terror plots originate in Pakistan, but to blow up civilians in the United States and Europe, terrorists need Western-based Muslims to carry out the attacks. Unfortunately, the next Faisal Shahzad may succeed. Pakistan should have remained neutral. We could have offered to assist the Americans, but not let our army act as mercenaries. The carnage now going on is because the army is seen as agents of America, and they are being squeezed by the anti-US forces who see them as puppets of the Americans on one side and on the other by the Americans themselves to carry out more operations against their own people. With jihad declared against it by the militants, there have been 40 major attacks on army installations. The first thing Washington has to accept is that it must withdraw from Afghanistan as soon as possible. With the death of Osama bin Laden, this is the perfect time for President Obama to announce victory and move out and give peace a chance. After all, it was only for Osama that the Americans first arrived in Afghanistan. This is the single most important step it can take in order to quell Muslim anger around the world and give the Afghan people a chance of peace and self-government. This would prevent Pakistan from descending into more violence. But this has to be managed properly so as to prevent a bloodbath along the lines of the post-Soviet Afghan chaos. Obama's bid to turn around the war with 30,000 additional troops has failed. He allowed himself to be swayed by generals whose understanding of strategy is confined to the battlefields and who cannot fathom Afghanistan. The deadly combination of a war of resistance against foreign occupation and the religious injunction to protect one's freedom means the Americans will never win. There will never be a shortage of recruits and people willing to die for their country. This war is not about numerical or armament might. In the words of Pakistani journalist Mir Adnan Aziz, Afghanistan is a lost duel. History, geography, and culture make the area a nightmare for any foreign presence attempting to impose its will on the nation. The urgent need to seek some kind of deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan was gaining currency in 2010 and early 2011. There were reports that the United States had begun direct, secret talks with senior Afghan Taliban leaders on finding a political settlement. US ally the UK also seems to have been pushing for a peaceful solution, and the head of its armed forces, General Sir David Richards, said a defeat of Islamist militancy, in the sense of a clear-cut victory, is unnecessary and unachievable, and that it can only be contained. Meanwhile, a British parliamentary report warned in March 2011 that the window of opportunity for talks was closing. The Taliban, for all their faults, are an Afghan, not an international group. Afghans have not risen up and joined the international jihad espoused by Al-Qaeda. Afghans have not been found to be involved in terror attacks or plots in the United States or Europe. They are also unlikely to allow a new Taliban regime to operate as it did before, or permit Al-Qaeda to exert so much influence over their government again. This is backed up by a report by Kandahar-based researchers, Alex Trick Van Linchoten and Felix Kuhn, saying Afghan Taliban leaders would be willing to make a break with Al-Qaeda in order to end hostilities and could be persuaded to ensure Afghanistan was not used as a base for terrorism. The Taliban, therefore, need to be dealt with through an Afghan political system with peace talks and the establishment of a new government of consensus negotiated with the assistance of Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. They should also be given some kind of incentive to isolate Al-Qaeda. At the moment, the US has a totally confused policy of a fight and talk approach. They want to open dialogue, but keep bombing at the same time. Tragically, their approach is never going to work. When so many civilians are being treated as Taliban fighters by the Americans, 80% of those taken as Taliban are released within 2 weeks because they are civilians. And in July 2011, the UN has said there has been the largest number of civilian casualties since the surge. Pakistan's position is made worse by its geographical situation, hemmed in from the south and east by an unfriendly India, bordering an Iran that fears being sandwiched between a pro-US Iraq and a pro-US Afghanistan, and not far from a Russia that doesn't want the Muslim republics to feed off the strife in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The US will always be worried about a hostile Al-Qaeda. All the players have a stake there, and peace will only come when all the players are at the table. And as for what government there should be in Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan will have to find a solution for themselves without outside interference. Withdrawal from Afghanistan is essential for defeating the insurgency in Pakistan. As Graham Fuller, former CIA station chief in Kabul and author of The Future of Political Islam, wrote in the Huffington Post in 2009, only the withdrawal of American and NATO boots on the ground will begin to allow the process of near frantic emotions to subside within Pakistan and for the region to start to cool down. Pakistan is experienced in governance and is well able to deal with its own Islamists and tribalists under normal circumstances. Until recently, Pakistani Islamists had one of the lowest rates of electoral success in the Muslim world. But US policies have now driven local nationalism, xenophobia, and Islamism to combine fever pitch. As Washington demands that Pakistan redeem failed American policies in Afghanistan, Islamabad can no longer manage its domestic crisis. Talk to people like General Orakzai, Rustam Shah, and Ayas Wazir, two former Pakistani ambassadors from Fatah, as well as former political agents for the tribal area. My personal estimate is that about 90% of the militants in the tribal areas are neither religious extremists nor terrorists. They are simply our own tribal people fighting because of army interventions, drone attacks, and their collateral damage, and anger over the US occupation of Afghanistan. We only need to deal with the remaining 10%. Some of these will be men who were part of the original jihadi organizations that once fought the Soviets and now consider themselves Taliban. Others will be members of Al-Qaeda. Some will be hardcore ideologues who believe in an Islamic emirate. And some will be people driven to extremism because of injustices like the Lal Masjid bloodbath. The solution does not lie in more military action. It lies in isolating that 10%. But it can only happen if the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, or Pakistan pulls out of the war on terror and the army withdraws from tribal areas. I have spoken to General Pasha, head of the LSI, about this, And he too believes that if we disengage from the US war, start a dialogue with the tribes, and withdraw troops from the tribal areas, we could eliminate this 10% in 90 days, the moment the US leaves Afghanistan. The anti-American feelings that feed into Islamic radicalism will dissipate. That will free Pakistan up to be able to deal with terrorism on its own terms and focus on bringing stakeholders together to agree on how to bring peace and reconciliation to the tribal areas. But only a credible Pakistani government that is not perceived to be a US stooge will be able to conduct a meaningful dialogue with insurgents and placate the tribes, who should be co-opted into helping the government tackle the real terrorists. As the situation changes in Afghanistan, we also have an opportunity now to decide what kind of country we want Pakistan to become.